1988, I was a college student in Los Angeles when I heard my pastor preach against homosexuality from Romans 1 at the height of the AIDS crisis. In that sermon, he barraged us with one statistic after another on the rampant promiscuity in the gay community, drawing a direct line from their sexual excesses to the consequences of death for so many by AIDS. Then he closed our time with a prayer for the salvation of these sinners, though I didn't believe God would answer it. Didn't he just say that God had given them over to their unbridled immorality? There wasn't much hope for these homosexuals, but I bowed my head in prayer, along with everyone else, going through the motions of asking for a miracle, when all I really expected was judgment. Now let's pretend that college student me back in 1988 got into a time machine, Marty McFly style, and I travel 30 years into the future, and I'm in St. Louis in 2018, where a certain conference called Revoice was being held. This conference was being organized by self-professing gay Christians. Wait, I thought God abandoned these homosexuals to their lifestyle, so they had no interest in spiritual things. And then I find out Revoice is about gay Christians encouraging one another to follow in the traditional historical Christian teaching on marriage and sexuality, committing to celibacy or mixed orientation marriage. From promiscuity to celibacy and abstinence? Well, this is a miracle. God answered our prayers. Hey, is my old pastor at Revoice, was he invited as a keynote speaker? He'd be thrilled to see so many people we thought were lost following on this costly path of Christian obedience. I turned to Christian media to hear what people are saying about this amazing turn of events, and I'm stunned to discover everyone is outraged by Revoice. The church is exploding with indignation. The president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary even accuses Revoice of being responsible for, quote, the chaos and confusion which are the inevitable products of the sexual revolution. I didn't know that following in the traditional Christian teaching on marriage and sexuality was now considered by Southern Baptists to be a product of the sexual revolution. Well, 2018 sure is a strange year. There are times when God answers our prayers, but we fail to recognize it. Why is that? Why does that happen? Quite often it's because the answer we got didn't fit in with what we expected. Our wrong expectations blinded us to what God was doing. Do you remember Naaman the Syrian, the captain of the Aramean army, who was also a leper? He heard there was a prophet in Israel who could heal him. So he arrived at the doorstep of Elisha with his entourage of servants and horsemen and chariots, because he envisioned Elisha would come out and wave his hands over him and call upon the name of the Lord in a dramatic fashion. Instead, Elisha didn't even come out of the house. He sent a messenger to go out and tell him to wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Well, Naaman was offended. This was not what he signed up for, and he was not going to wash in that mud puddle of a river, and he was about to turn around and leave when his servant stopped him. Please, sir, just do what the prophet says. It's not asking much. So Naaman listened, and he did go wash in the Jordan, and he was completely healed. But the way it came to him was by design. He could not receive the answer to his request until he first humbled himself and let go of his own expectations. Somehow we straight Christians missed out on the work God has been doing among gay Christians these past 30-plus years. We've missed out on understanding what this gathering of gay Christians is all about. Is it not a positive response to the moral stand the conservative church has been taking all these years on sexual purity, on God's design for marriage, on sexual responsibility and self-control? This gathering is a way of saying to the conservative church, you know what? We agree with you. You're right. Did you hear that? It's a way of saying, we agree with you. You're right. That's nice to hear, isn't it? And it seems like it should be obvious. But maybe the reason straight Christians have been blind to what God is doing among sexual minority Christians is because, like Naaman, we've had the wrong expectations. And setting those aside means humbling ourselves. In other words, to enjoy the satisfaction of being right, we first need to admit we've also been wrong. The ex-gay movement held out the promise that gay people could become straight. Yet this past 40-plus years of ex-gay ministry has been the story of one failure after another to achieve genuine sexual orientation change, crescendoing in 2013 with the collapse of Exodus International. According to the former president of Exodus, gay people did not become straight 99.9% of the time. They could not pray the gay away, nor could many of the straight family members and friends who prayed along with them. The God who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist apparently did not exercise his power to effect orientation change. Gay people are still gay. Now, normally when you pray for something for a few decades and get this kind of non-result, we call it a closed door. The burden of proof would lie with anyone who thinks it's still worthwhile to keep on trying, right? So it's interesting that instead of letting go and adjusting our expectations, we straight Christians have immediately turned from the disappointment of ex-gay ministry to perfecting arguments for why a Christian can't identify as gay. We say it contradicts your identity in Christ. It's like calling yourself a murdering Christian, or an adulterous Christian, or a lustful Christian. Now, these arguments only work if we redefine the word gay to mean someone who is either actively having gay sex or is in a continual state of lust or sinful desire. And when gay Christians tell us that's not what they mean by gay, we rather perversely insist that we know better than they do what they mean. Now, some try to explain that while their sexual orientation is fallen, the human experience of being gay is actually not too different from the experience of being straight, but our response is to be offended that they would compare themselves to us and accuse them of buying into secularism. So it seems to me that we aren't interested in improving our arguments beyond the straw man and the ad hominem variety, but we are very interested in the goal of getting these Christians not to identify as gay. Just don't say the word gay. But our self-imposed confusion over the term gay has blinded us from making one very important observation. Since God has providentially refrained from changing people's sexual orientations, then he is the one who has chosen not to change their identity. That's why gay Christians, properly understood, still call themselves gay. So why are we taking issue with them when all they've done is read the hand of providence and bend the knee, sometimes bitterly, sometimes tearfully, to God's sovereign will over their lives? We are the ones who have remained unbending. So is our quarrel really with gay Christians, or is it with God himself? The identity of a Christian cannot be with any culture defined in its essence by the rejection of God's design and command. So wrote one prominent critic of the 2018 Revoice conference. Because secular gay culture celebrates what is contrary to God's design and command, no Christian should ever identify as gay, even if they themselves don't celebrate or practice gay sex. This critic's description reminded me of another group of people. According to the Bible, the culture of this people was lawlessness. Their history was hostility to God and his people, and they are described characteristically as lustful, sexually immoral, hard-hearted, idolatrous, hedonistic, greedy, ignorant, and estranged from God. Who are they? They are the Gentiles. And today we often use the phrase Gentile Christians to refer to these non-Jewish converts to the faith. We're apparently comfortable with the term, but is it an oxymoron? Gentile was used interchangeably with the term sinners by both Jesus and the apostles. For instance, Matthew 18, Jesus says, if your brother sins, confront him in private. If he doesn't listen to you, bring 2 or 3 witnesses. Doesn't listen to them, have the church confront him. And if the church can't get him to listen, Jesus concludes, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax gatherer. A Gentile, a person who is unrepentant, someone who is hardened in sin. Jesus was simply following Jewish cultural norms when he used the term Gentile in this derogatory way. Galatians 2:15, Paul says, "We are Jews by nature, not sinners from among the Gentiles." Gentiles equals sinners in the Jewish mind of that day. Why? Well, it's because their culture was permeated with idolatrous practices, unclean foods, and every kind of sexual immorality, not to mention Gentile history. 17 centuries of hostility toward the Jews, including their enslavement under Pharaoh and the Egyptians, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, the Moabites who tried to curse them, Goliath of Gath, and the Philistine army, Nebuchadnezzar who carried them into exile, Haman the Agagite who ordered the extermination of the Jewish race, and Pontius Pilate who delivered up their Christ to execution. Kind of makes the Stonewall riots, ACT UP, and a bunch of gay pride parades seem like nothing by comparison. Imagine being a first-century Jewish believer and hearing us use the term Gentile Christian, with that scandalous adjective tainting the noun Christian. Actually, the term Gentile Christian doesn't appear in the New Testament because the Apostle Paul was even more scandalous. He just called Gentile Christians Gentiles, the noun, not even the adjective. And he allows the context to show whether he's speaking of Christians or non-Christians. For instance, the Gentiles who have believed, as opposed to the Gentiles who do not know God. Today, this would be the equivalent of saying, let's encourage the gays who have believed to attend Revoice so they can be equipped to reach out to the gays who do not know God. Assuming we understand the term gay correctly, that would be proper language to use according to New Testament standards. Now, Paul knows he's swimming upstream with this language. There were a lot of Jews who didn't want Gentile believers to be received into the church as Gentiles. They wanted them to change their identity. They wanted to send them to ex-Gentile camp. And there was such thing back then. It was called circumcision. They wanted to Judaize them, which is why we refer to this faction today as the Judaizers. To see the parallels to our controversy today, let's explore some first-century context a little bit more. See, sometimes we think the divide between Jew and Gentile was about race or culture or ethnicity, but to the Jews of that time, it was really about one thing: their identity, specifically their relationship to the law of God. The Jews were a people under the law. The Gentiles were a people without the law. The law was written in their hearts, but they were a people outside the law covenant given to Israel. Getting circumcised was how you put yourself under the law. For Gentiles, circumcision was the rite of passage into a Jewish identity. The Apostle Paul refused to send Gentile Christians to ex-Gentile camp. Yes, he had Timothy circumcised because Timothy was Jewish through his mother's line, but he refused to have Titus circumcised because Titus was fully Greek. Circumcision isn't inherently bad, it's all about the motive. To circumcise Titus would have been saying he needed to take on a Jewish identity to be saved, that faith in Christ wasn't enough. He needed to put himself under the law and identify with all the practices, standards, and attitudes of Judaism. Keeping his Gentile identity didn't mean Titus was free from moral standards. Remember the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15? They laid out plenty of moral standards for the Gentile Christians. Abstain from sexual immorality, from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from things strangled. But circumcision was not on the list. And the Gentile Christians who received the letter from that council rejoiced because they were already eager to live holy lives. But now they wouldn't have to be treated as second-class citizens in the church. Were there advantages to being a Jew? Yes, great in every respect. Paul concedes this in Romans 3, verses 1 through 2. One advantage is the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Now, the Judaizers weren't demanding circumcision because they expected people to keep the law perfectly. It's more like being Jewish was simply better than being Gentile. The Gentiles didn't have the law, and their entire culture reflected it. At least the Jews had the oracles of God. Sure, we don't keep the law perfectly, but at least we're in the ballpark. The Gentiles aren't even in the ballpark. But Paul knew that while being in the ballpark was good, it was not good enough. And it might even become a stumbling block that blinds you from what really matters. Because when it comes to the gospel, what matters is not the privilege you start out in, but where you ultimately end up. And for the Jews, that was at the exact same place as the Gentiles, at the foot of the cross as lawbreakers. In fact, Paul said that his identity as a Jew ended up in a rubbish heap in view of the surpassing glory of Christ. Philippians 3, verses 5 through 8, circumcised the 8th day, of the nation Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee. But whatever things were gained to me, those things I have counted as loss for the sake of Christ, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them but rubbish, in order that I might gain Christ. And if that weren't enough, Paul goes further than that. In Galatians 2, 15 through 16, he starts out by saying, we are Jews by nature, and not sinners from among the Gentiles. See, this is our nature, that's their nature. Nevertheless, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but through faith in Christ Jesus, even we have believed in Christ Jesus. Verse 17, but if, while seeking to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have also been found sinners, is Christ then a minister of sin? May it never be. Wait, Paul's calling himself a sinner? I thought the Gentiles were the sinners. It's one thing for Paul to toss his Jewish identity in a trash heap. It's another to identify himself with a label he reserved for the Gentiles. Why? Because the gospel is not, you Gentiles, come up to our level of righteousness and get circumcised. Give up your identity and take on ours. Rather, the gospel says, in view of the surpassing glory of Christ, we Jews find ourselves identifying with you Gentiles, because you tell us something about who we are, fellow sinners, fellow lawbreakers, who are in need of the exact same grace. Are there advantages to being heterosexual? Why, yes, great in every respect. For one thing, the institution of marriage, as God originally designed it, is something we find suitable to our needs and satisfying to our natural desires. It demands faithfulness to one another in thought, word, and deed, where a husband loves his wife as Christ loved the church and lays down his life for her, where the wife submits herself to her husband as to the Lord, where single men and single women treat each other with all purity, knowing how to possess their bodies in sanctification and honor. Do we straights keep these things perfectly? No, of course not. But at least we're making the attempt to do them while being attracted to the right gender. We're not like the gays, right? I mean, they can't even get out of the starting blocks without being headed in the wrong gender direction. At least we're in the ballpark. They're not even in the ballpark. But when it comes to the gospel, what matters is not the sexual identity privilege you start out in, but where you ultimately end up, which is in the exact same place as everyone who is not straight, at the foot of the cross as sexually broken human beings. Because you aren't faithful in your marriage in thought, word, and deed. And you don't lay down your life for your wife as Christ did for the church. And you don't perfectly submit to your husband as to the Lord. And perhaps you even have moments where you wonder, what happened to the love that we once had for one another? When will I stop being so angry at him? When will I stop being so resentful of her? I've been married 10 years. Why isn't my porn problem going away? Or if you're single, will I always be attracted to the wrong man? Will I ever be good enough to attract the right woman? How come every relationship I'm in follows the same dysfunctional pattern as my parents' marriage? The gospel does not say, you gays, come up to our level of righteousness with the help of ex-gay ministry, give up your gay identity and become straight like us. Rather, the gospel says, in view of the surpassing glory of Christ, we straights actually find ourselves identifying with you gays, because you tell us something about who we are, that we can't change our sexual orientation toward brokenness any more than you can. And we need you to encourage us that the grace you have found to be sufficient for your lives can be sufficient for our lives too. The circumcision controversy in the New Testament still speaks to us today, doesn't it? Our modern issue of sexual orientation change and arguing about identity language turns out to be an echo from the past. Both are about demanding identity change for the sake of a human righteousness that you can boast in. Both are about Christ plus something else. And the ones who have the more privileged identity, the identity that seems more righteous from a human perspective, often fail to understand that not only does it need to be tossed in a rubbish heap in view of the glory of Christ, but can even become a stumbling block, a point of boasting that distracts you from putting your trust in Christ alone. For Christians today, it's not the gay identity that's the issue of concern, but the straight identity. So what are you saying, Misty? If we straights are supposed to identify with gays, are you saying gay sin is okay? Well, when Paul identified himself with Gentile sinners, he was also accused of what? Of making Christ a minister of sin. So the fact that the accusation comes up shows we're at least starting to think like the apostle. But of course, Paul's response was, may it never be. If Christ uses the law to reveal your sin, that doesn't make Christ an advocate of sin. And if Christ uses your marriage or failed relationships to reveal your sexual brokenness, that simply enables you to look at your gay brother or sister next to you at the feet of Jesus and say, you know what? If we both need the same remedy, it's because we both have the same ailment. So are you saying marriage is bad? It's only good for showing us our sexual brokenness? Well, Paul wasn't saying the law was bad, right? The law is holy and righteous and good, and so is Christian marriage. But we are of the flesh, sold into bondage of sin. We want to obey, but we lack the power to do it. And that's our fault. It's not the fault of God's good gift. So you're saying sexual orientation change is wrong. Is that it? Of course not. But just like with circumcision, it's all about the motive, isn't it? If you're gay and you desire change and God grants you that miracle, that's wonderful. But let's say you're straight and you push someone out of the church or dismiss them from serving as a Sunday school teacher or worship leader or even as a pastor, not because of a scandalous lifestyle, but simply because they have not experienced sexual orientation change. How is that not the heresy of the Judaizers? How is that not a Christ plus something else formula? Having begun by the Spirit, are we now being perfected by reparative therapy? Perhaps there is a reason why God has not answered so many of our prayers, of their prayers for sexual orientation change. Maybe it's because he didn't think it was necessary. Jesus is not ashamed to identify with gay Christians. We are. And if we are ashamed of them, we are ashamed of the Christ who accepts them and of the gospel that calls them. My straight brothers and sisters in Christ, let's follow in the example of Paul, the ex-Pharisee, who understood this temptation to be ashamed. But after he encountered the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, he was able to proclaim victory when he said, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile.